Welcome to The New Next, a podcast that addresses current events and how they will impact the future. Co-hosted by the inquisitive public speaking champion, Mike McVeigh, and energy, economics, and technology expert, Matt Jensen. Join us as we explore all things energy, economic, tech, and political, and how they will affect our future. Hey world, this is Mike McVeigh giving a bit of warning for Season 3 of Nobody's a Nobody podcast, the podcast where I interview people I find absolutely interesting, and I believe you will too if you give them a chance. Labor Day weekend will begin the promising Season 3 as we revisit some of our guests from Season 1 and get a clue on how they are doing, as well as interview a new slew to make up our episode queue. You can find us on Spotify, Audible, podcast players of your choice, and remember, nobody's a nobody. That means you. Until next time. I mentioned him before, and you can be like Aaron. You can submit questions that we will answer, and if you submit enough of them, then maybe you'll overtake Aaron. All right. He said, I saw this in an article on South Korea's multi-pronged approach to boost nuclear energy and wanted to get your thoughts. And here comes the quote. Quote, for years, nuclear proponents have argued that the relative dangers of nuclear energy are vastly exaggerated. In fact, a 2013 study by NASA scientists found that overall, nuclear energy has actually saved lives that would have otherwise been lost due to causes associated with air pollution from the combustion of fossil fuels, I'm reading really well, that nuclear has displaced. The model made by scientists at NASA's Goddard Institute found that over the past 50 years, nuclear had saved an incredible 1.8 million lives, a number that has surely grown considerably in the decade since the study was published, end quote. So, thoughts,
yeah,
Matt?
I agree. So I agree with this NASA study. I think nuclear energy is falsely demonized a lot. And when Fukushima collapsed, you had a huge had a lot of issues with that, and it was I'd say like a huge overreach. So like Germany after that basically implemented a plan to shut down their nuclear industry, which is an industry that creates very little waste, so it's easily storable. You know, you could power my energy consumption for my entire life on something probably smaller than this, size-wise. So very, very small. But you look at, there's Chernobyl and Fukushima and 3 Mile Island, I would say are kind of like your big things a lot of people reference as these are the biggest disasters that show how nuclear has been so devastating. Chernobyl, I don't think that there's really the fear is probably worse than the effect. I don't know the numbers of it. Fukushima too, there was this fear that there was going to be this mass radiation event where it would make all the water radioactive and then it would wash up on our shores in the Western United States, and there would be mass stuff for that. That didn't happen. 3 Mile Island, which is the biggest nuclear disaster, in quotes, I would say, in the U.S., was contained, essentially contained. Like they had to release some radioactive air out of it. I watched a documentary, I think on, it was either Netflix or Hulu recently, and it was about 3 Mile Island. And I was like, this is made to basically as a hit piece on nuclear. When you look at the 3 Mile Island disaster, there's never been a statistically proven increase in deaths by the people that were offset it. The nuclear radiation released in the air quality, it's debated on whether or not that was really measurable to a point where it could even affect anybody. And there's never been any deaths associated with it. On top of that, there's 2 reactors at 3 Mile Island right next to each other. One is still operational to this day. So basically, it's like a dead piece of cement that's sitting there on this island. It was billed as a disaster, but when I think about disaster, I think about the effects on human lives. And you're talking about, like, this study talks about that basically releasing chemicals through combustible fuels into the atmosphere versus having a zero emission or low emission sort of fuel. And it's just not even comparable. Like, one of the really odd things that I think with the general green movement is the inability to accept nuclear fuels as a viable alternative to, like, wind and solar. So I don't really understand it. Like, there's a lot of cool innovations, I would say, going on with nuclear fission, for instance, and also small modular nuclear reactors. Like, Bill Gates and some other people are building one in Wyoming right now. China is building a lot of these too. And those are maybe 100 megawatts, but basically smaller facilities that are cheaper, that can be put in areas where you essentially don't have to run a whole large city off of it. So I agree with this question, right? The dangers are relatively exaggerated. And I think a lot of people tie the weaponization of nuclear fuel to nuclear energy. And that's really the only thing that I can think of why people would be so against it like they are. So there's also non-weaponized nuclear fuel using thorium instead of uranium. And that's something that is very interesting. We'll have to talk about that on a future episode, but that's something that I'm curious why that hasn't taken off more, because there have been thorium nuclear plants in the past. So it's, yeah, I think if people look more at the facts on a lot of things in our energy stuff these days, rather than thinking from a purely emotional worst case scenario, what you might have seen in a movie, and thinking about, the tragedies that you saw at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a lot of people would have a far different view of this than they do right now. That's my opinion, but I've obviously spent years researching this topic particularly, and I'm constantly confused of the debate, public debate.
Well, I know you're only asking Matt and not me, Aaron, but I'm just to give my thoughts. I'm probably more on the conservative side on this. However, I do agree that nuclear energy as a whole should be tapped into more. Like, most of what Matt has said, I completely agree with, and I think that it is an underutilized source. And I think you nailed it on the head. It's the stigma that's attached to nuclear, specifically the approximately 450,000 people that died in the World War II from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That image, and then even later in 1964 election, at least for us Americans, when the thing that really pushed Lyndon B. Johnson over Barry Goldwater was, you want to know what would happen if Barry Goldwater was president, and then there's this explosion of the atom bomb going off, and you're seeing the cloud
great
that comes
point
after it. So we have used nuclear. I won't say nuclear energy, because what your actual question is about nuclear energy, but we've used the stigma attached to nuclear as a devastating and a deadly thing. And so I don't want to take away the impact, pun not intended, of what nuclear energy can do. It can be very devastating, but so can pretty much every other form of energy out there. In fact, there's not a form of energy that is not devastating. We live here in Oklahoma, and wind, in certain conditions, literally tears not just a neighborhood apart, but a whole cities apart with tornadoes. Water, hurricanes, coal. We've talked about in the past with Hawaii, like there's certain trade-offs that are happening, but coal can pollute the air at a higher level, but it's still very functional as an energy source. So I don't think there is a form of energy that's not dangerous. And I don't know, and nuclear is probably the only one that has the stigma of the danger level being a lot worse than what it provides, because almost every form of energy has a danger associated with it. And maybe nuclear energy is relatively more dangerous, but not to the degree. So, your question was about it being vastly exaggerated. Probably vastly exaggerated is a little bit over. I don't know if it's exaggerated though, because there is a lot of other things that could happen. But fortunately in that specific industry, because we're so scared of it, 3 Mile Island can happen the way it happened with literally little, if any damage at all. But whenever it's not taken care of, places like Chernobyl can happen. So maybe if we were scared of all energy the way that we were scared of nuclear energy, overall things would be safer and emissions would be lower. So I don't want to say that the danger isn't there, and I don't want to say that it's vastly exaggerated, but maybe it's exaggerated to the point that we have exaggerated too much in the sense that we're not able to move forward with it the way we could and probably should. Would that be a fair thing to say, Matt?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I was just looking up Chernobyl. So basically, Chernobyl, 30 people died from the immediate blast trauma and acute radiation syndrome in the seconds to months after the disaster, with 60 total in the decade. And those were primarily people that responded to it or people that were working at the plant at the time. And there's really a lot of debate on whether or not, let's see. So I think part of the issue with Chernobyl was it basically released all the radiation to the air, and the nuclear power plant wasn't built correctly. So in cases where it is pretty much built correctly, in 3 Mile Island, it did its job, which was essentially contain it, right? Because they can't really blow up like a nuclear bomb. It's not weaponized to do that. So long-term death estimates is 4,000 to a high of 16,000. And yeah, so that's according to the UN.
And I'd like to add actually something so this is going to be one of the things that I know scared me about Chernobyl growing up in the 80s and early 90s particular, were the pictures they would show of the area surrounding. So one of the things I did a few years ago, right before the pandemic, I watched a lot of videos of
those are awesome
amusement parks. And one of them that they showed was the one in New Orleans that got decimated after Hurricane Katrina. And I kid you not, there are a lot of similarities between we're talking about just maybe a year or two after Hurricane Katrina, how the New Orleans theme park looked as the area around Chernobyl. And I don't want to make light at all of the difference between radiation, but there were other things that the hurricane, we're talking about mold and stuff. There's a lot of other dangerous things. So again, I don't want to understate the power of nuclear, but I want to say that some of those other sources are just as dangerous, if not.
There's still people that have never left Chernobyl. They refuse to leave, and they're still living there.
Right.
Yeah, I know.
Same in New Orleans.
Right.
I mean, what? No. Sorry for all of you Cajuns out there.
I think that
don't be raging.
The risks are. So I think like you're talking about, FEMA provides low interest loans to basically subsidize building after natural disasters. So Houston, for instance, had a lot of flooded homes in recent years. And that's a program where it basically incentivizes building houses in places that are likely to get wiped out of floods. I find stuff like that, just because you brought it up, as a bigger danger to life than basically, all this nuclear sort of stuff.
And I know it's going to be coming up in a future episode. Again, I'm going to point this out because this is probably all going to be one episode. But when we talk about some of the things with quitting oil, we sometimes forget that a lot of the stuff with climate change and with the ozone layer, things of that nature that we've grown up, or that I've grown up with, it's not that those things aren't real. If anything, and this is ultimately the debate, is the escalated timeline. How much are we basically fast forwarding to what's already going to happen? And that's something that Matt's been able to help me out with a lot of the problems were going to happen no matter what, but we might have accelerated the timeline a little bit on some areas. And that's actually that's a lot of the things we talk about, is what's been accelerated. Maybe we've accelerated accidentally. We talked about solar panels a little while ago, of how solar panels might have actually accelerated the decline of the earth more because of the trash that it's caused, the pollution it's caused from that. Even though the idea
there's no free lunch, basically.
So, yeah. So man-made disasters, at least statistically, have still done a whole lot less harm than natural disasters. That doesn't mean we necessarily want to continue making man-made disasters, because there are other effects. But yeah, Aaron, if that's not a good enough answer for you, then I'm just feeling. If you would like to learn more about the New Next podcast, find us at thenewnextpodcast.com, where you can suggest a topic you would like for us to cover. If you enjoyed what you heard, share the podcast, tell a friend about it, or rate us with 5 stars.